Hi and welcome. This is Ricky Spencer and part of our series Sociology of Media Voices, Media Bites. We today have the pleasure of meeting well-renowned author and activist Jo Hirst, also known as the Gender Fairy. Jo Hirst is a former primary school teacher who wrote Australia's first picture book for transgender children, The Gender Fairy. Growing up in a family that didn't believe in gender stereotyping, Jo's mother was a builder who liked working with her hands. Her father was an English teacher with a talent for storytelling. Jo is passionate about writing books that challenges some of the stereotypes in our society and allows all children to see themselves represented in literature. Jo has written about children and gender in many publications, including the Archer magazine, Sydney Morning Herald, SBS, Meanjin and The Guardian. Jo currently volunteers for parents of gender diverse children in her community. She lives by the seaside in Melbourne, Australia, with her partners and two sons, one of whom is transgender. Well, welcome, Jo.
Hello, and thank you.
Wow. So much we could say, and just reading that, I'm just so inspired. So maybe, Jo, just tell us a bit about your journey and how you got to decide to write a book about first Australian picture book for transgender children.
The Gender Fairy came about because I couldn't find a book to read to my child. So I wrote a story for him. And I was actually having a conversation with Dr. Michelle Telfer, and I said, look, I've written this story. Would you like to give it to the kids at the Gender Service? And she said, look, why don't you publish it? So I did. I self-published that book. I didn't try and go to a publisher because back, I think, 2015, we had that conversation. I didn't think anyone would publish a book about transgender children, so I didn't even try. And the story sort of went from there. I guess you could say it's been a journey since then.
And after writing that book, how did you sort of feel? Like, you obviously then took that book to other children or your own child? How did it sort of afterwards?
Oh, it was a lovely experience in a lot of ways. I've had messages, and still do, from children around the world saying thank you, children taking it to bed with them and sleeping with it, taking it to school, showing it to their family and friends, saying this is me, this is who I am, saying how much it helped them. And that side of it's really, really lovely. Obviously, you know, there have been some extreme groups that have used it for harm, which has been really, really difficult to deal with when you write a story out of love for your family and for other children. To see it used in such a negative way is really hurtful and really distressing. But I have to say, it's done so much good. It's been really, really worth. Obviously started me on a path for advocacy because it gave me a voice in a way to be an advocate for other families and for very young children. So that was a gift in a way that enabled me to voice some of the needs that aren't being met for young trans children.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Especially when you start mentioning the voices for transgender children and gender non-conforming children. Since your book has been published, have you noticed has there been any other people who have written more, or have schools embraced it, or are you still finding it a little bit difficult to get the message across to have your book within all school spaces?
Well, that's a complicated question to answer. I guess to answer the first question, in the last couple of years, we've seen quite a few picture books being published for transgender children and gender diverse children, which are really, really wonderful, which has been fantastic. And that's really, really good to see. And more trans voices in that space as well, which is even more fantastic. So I'd have to say there have been some great books published in the last couple of years, and that's been great to see. Not a lot, but a few. In terms of getting picture books into schools, that is a very, very slow process. The problem with young children in schools and in kinders is that schools, it's almost like a culture of silence surrounds gender and young children in kinders and schools. And schools take a very reactive approach rather than a proactive approach and a whole school approach. So what they will tend to do is, if there's a child making a transition and they have to address the topic, for example, that child is changing their name, their pronoun, their clothing, things like that that are really obvious, and they have no choice but to address it, then they may read a picture book as a response to that. Unfortunately, what that does is it places an awful lot of burden on the child and that family, who are very, very new to this experience, very stressed about what other people are going to think. They don't know necessarily where to look for resources. And the school, the principal, the kindergarten teacher, the school teacher are going to that family saying, right, what can you give us to help explain your child to the classroom? And in some cases, they're asking the parents to write or approve the guidelines for the school, or they're asking the child to explain themselves to the class. Sometimes the child's happy to do this, but this is by no means appropriate. So I think what we would like to see is more of a whole school approach, where schools are talking about gender and identity at every single level throughout school life, starting at kindergarten. So through kindergarten and primary school, at least once every year, school curriculums will talk about identity. And this is a perfect time to be talking about gender. So when schools teach about identity, often they'll talk about things like culture, multiculturalism. Sometimes they'll talk about disability. There's plenty of things they talk about. What they don't talk about is gender expression and gender diversity. And that's the perfect time to fit that into curriculum. So if you have a look at my second book, for example, A House for Everyone, in that book you've got a young boy who has long hair and loves to do artwork. You've got a boy who wears dresses. You've got a girl who, I don't like the word tomboy because clothes and toys belong to everyone. They're not gendered, but she has short hair. She doesn't like to wear dresses. And you have a trans boy and a non-binary child, and they just play together. And at the back of the book, the last words are, we are all the same. We are all different. We are all friends. And there's a lesson plan, very loose lesson plan at the back, where you can make a mural with those words. And all the children draw themselves, freely expressing themselves, so what they like to wear and sometimes what they like to play with. And it's a very simple, wholesome lesson that anyone in childhood education can do. And a lot of kinders and early years schools do that lesson plan, and it works really well. But there's nothing in any school curriculum in Australia that I'm aware of that embeds that into the curriculum. So these things are only approached when there's a child in transition. And what that ends up doing is causing a lot of minority stress for trans and gender diverse children. So while they might have that explained in one lesson when they transition, young kids will forget. And there's nothing addressing anything to do with gender as they get older until they reach perhaps high school. So a lot of bullying can take place as they get older. A lot of kids can forget and say, hey, were you a boy? Were you a girl? Are you a girl? Are you a boy? Was that you in prep and kinder? All that sort of stuff can happen right through primary school. And then by the time you've got a child going into high school, they're an anxious mess with the minority stress they've gone through right through primary school. So there's a number of reasons why we need a whole school approach here. It should not be the burden of that family and that child to have the focus of attention on them when they transition at school. These things need to be embedded into the curriculum. And I think we need more research in the areas of trans and gender diverse children at early education. All the focus is on the over 13s because it is easier to do research with over 13s. And early education, so that we can get these resources into the curriculum. That's my long answer.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I'm thinking that you covered the fact that the importance of the education space sort of really taking a more proactive approach into realizing that, rather than just waiting for a child to self-identify, that they want to affirm their gender identity, but to consider, well, how can we make the classroom spaces and the curriculum to allow for discussions to take place. And I guess, Jo, I'd like to ask you, because we talk always about the child that that comes forward and says it, but I was just wondering, you, with your work with your parents, the process of a child coming out to their family, obviously for some children it might take a long time.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you, like, do you think that if schools were to be more proactive, and I guess with teacher training, to be better teacher trained, and maybe perhaps even having teachers who are trans within the schools, do you feel that perhaps might be a way forward to kind of address some of these underlying issues that you presented?
Absolutely. We get so many parents calling us saying, my child's told me at age, 12, 16, 17, 20, but if they'd had the language to know earlier, then they would have been able to verbalise it and work it out in their heads so much earlier. And older trans people will come to me and say, if only I'd had the language when I was younger. So you can't assume sitting in your classroom that everybody in there is cisgender. You just can't assume that. You don't know. So it's very, very, very important to teach all children the language around gender identity and gender expression, I believe, for that reason. Now, trans representation throughout the curriculum is also very important. To have more trans teachers in schools, to have some out trans teachers in schools would be so super fantastic as a number one step there. Number two, to have some trans representation throughout the curriculum would be a lovely, lovely thing that normalises the fact that being transgender is just a normal part of human diversity. That would be another step. The other step too that's really important, that when we're designing curriculum for young trans children, is that we take into account that the experience of each generation changes very, very quickly. So, for example, what our current transgender 16-year-olds experienced when they were in grade 6 or in prep is very, very different to the experience that our current grade 6s are having and that our current preps and kindergarten kids are having. And that changes very, very quickly. So when you're making new curriculum resources, you need to engage with the cohorts in Year 7 if you're making a Year 7 curriculum, or you need to engage with the cohorts in grade 4, or you need to engage with the students in prep and kinder, and really get an idea of what reflects them and what's best for their experience in their current environment and how they're experiencing life, because it changes so quickly. Our community and our society is changing really, really quickly. So this needs to be taken into consideration, because some of our resources that we have, especially some of our high school resources, become quickly out of date and very, very inappropriate for our current students. So it'd be great to see some research done around that as well.
Well, that's wonderful. You've really shown us the way forward and some of the key areas to address. And I guess as we wrap up the interview, I just want to ask you, what sort of parting words would you like to leave the viewers of this channel in relation to how can we support transgender, gender non-conforming young children and students?
Well, I think if you could just explain to all children the meaning and the difference between gender identity and gender expression, and let them know that things like clothes and toys don't have a gender, allow them to be free to be themselves, that's a really, really good start.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you, Jo Hirst, so much for your informative speech. I must add, if any parents or teachers out there who would like to support you or to become involved, is there a website or a contact email that they can contact you?
Yeah, if you need to contact me specifically, you can email me at thegenderfairy@gmail.com, or you can go to my website, johirst.com. If you need parent support, you can go to Parents of Gender Diverse Children, on the website is pgdc.org.au. And there are lots of resources there for each state, and there is a contact information for parents and professionals. And I think they're just doing up their education section of the website soon, so that'll be up and running again soon.
Well, thank you so much, Jo Hirst. It's been a pleasure to listen to your wonderful lived experiences and really providing a voice for our children and parents of gender and non-conforming, gender diverse and transgender children. Thank you so much, Jo.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.